He had everything: fame, beauty, power, a career big enough to make millions believe it could never really break. And then the break happened in public. That is what makes Park Yoo-chun such a dangerous story to tell. Not because he was unknown and fell, not because he was unstable and disappeared, but because he was once the kind of star people thought would survive anything. He had already crossed the line from idol to phenomenon. He was not just successful, he was one of the faces of an era. Which is exactly why the collapse hit so hard. Before the headlines turned dark, before the scandals swallowed his name, before the handcuffs and public shame rewrote the story, Park Yoo-chun was the kind of celebrity the industry builds monuments around. He was one of the stars who helped define what K-pop power looked like in its most explosive years. As a member of TVXQ and later JYJ, he stood inside one of the biggest waves Korean entertainment had ever sent across Asia. Reuters noted that he rose to fame through TVXQ before later forming JYJ with two former bandmates. That level of fame changes a person, not just because the world starts looking at you differently, but because it starts treating you like a symbol instead of a man. Park Yoo-chun was not just another singer with fans. He was part of a machine that produced obsession, stadium-scale devotion, media saturation, the kind of public affection that makes a star feel both invincible and permanently exposed at the same time. And exposure is where the danger begins. Because fame at that level does not leave room for ordinary failure. Once the public crowns you, it stops imagining you as fragile. It stops imagining you as someone who can rot, panic, lie, spiral, or self-destruct like everyone else. It wants the image to stay clean, even if the life underneath it is already cracking. That is why stories like his are never really about one scandal. They are about the slow violence of being turned into something too large to fall safely. Park Yoo-chun did not only have music. He had the other thing that makes collapse even more dramatic: legitimacy beyond the stage. He moved into acting and became one of those rare figures who seemed able to carry both idol fame and screen credibility at once. That matters because once an idol crosses into acting successfully, the public stops seeing him as temporary. He starts to look permanent, established, protected by talent, not just hype. That illusion is powerful. It also makes the eventual damage much uglier. Because the higher the image rises, the more brutal the correction becomes when it finally comes. And with Park Yoo-chun, the correction would not arrive as a quiet decline. It would arrive with denial, investigation, arrest, and the kind of public humiliation that forces even loyal fans to confront a question they never wanted to ask. Who was he when the stage lights were gone? That question did not exist in the early years. In the early years, the story looked almost mythic. A star with looks, influence, fandom, and reach across Asia. A man who seemed too embedded in celebrity history to be erased, too beloved to become cautionary, too elevated to collapse like ordinary people do. But celebrity has a cruel pattern. The stars who look safest from ruin are often the ones carrying the most dangerous illusion of all. That success can protect character, that admiration can protect truth, that being loved by millions somehow makes consequences less likely to arrive. It doesn't. And Park Yoo-chun's story would prove that in the ugliest possible way. Because once the scandal came, the public would not just watch a man fall, it would watch an empire around his image start tearing itself apart. At first, the fall didn't look possible. That was the illusion. Because Park Yoo-chun wasn't just famous, he was the kind of famous people build excuses for. The kind that can survive rumors, outlast fan wars, and keep moving because the machine around him is simply too big to stop. He had already done what very few idols ever manage. He crossed from music into acting and made the public believe he belonged in both worlds. TVXQ made him powerful, JYJ made him defiant, acting made him credible. Reuters noted that he first rose through TVXQ and later re-emerged in JYJ after the split from SM. That combination is dangerous. Because once a celebrity has fandom, mythology, and legitimacy, people stop seeing him as vulnerable to ordinary collapse. They assume fame itself will absorb the damage. A scandal might bruise the image, but the structure stays standing until it doesn't. By the time Yoo-chun's acting career was working in his favor, the image had become even stronger than the music era. He was no longer only an idol with screaming fans behind him. He was a man with screen presence, awards, leading roles, and the kind of public familiarity that turns a celebrity into a fixture. His acting resume helped harden the idea that he wasn't temporary hype. He looked established, rooted, permanent. That permanence was part of the trap. Because the higher the image rises, the uglier the correction becomes when people realize it was never as secure as it looked. And with Park Yoo-chun, the cracks started carrying a different kind of danger. Not just gossip, not just noise, but the slow feeling that his name was becoming more combustible every time it returned to the headlines. Then came 2019, and the story stopped being about image management. Reuters reported that Park Yoo-chun was arrested on allegations that he had bought about 1.5 grams of methamphetamine with his former girlfriend and used the drug several times. At the time, he denied wrongdoing, saying he had never taken drugs, and he denied the charges again in court, according to Yonhap, as cited by Reuters. His management company also said it would terminate his contract and that he would leave the entertainment industry. That was the moment the illusion changed shape. Not because celebrities had never fallen before, because this was Park Yoo-chun, a man who had already lived at a level of fame where people assume the floor doesn't exist anymore. And suddenly the public was no longer watching a star glide through scandal. It was watching him collide with consequence in real time. The denial made it harsher. The arrest made it uglier. The public shame made it impossible to keep telling the older story. Because now the question was no longer whether Park Yoo-chun had been one of the biggest stars in Asia. It was whether a man who had once seemed untouchable had finally run out of places to hide. The scandal didn't just damage Park Yoo-chun, it stripped him. First the denial, then the arrest, then the kind of public collapse that leaves no room for dignity, only replay. That is when the story stopped being about a celebrity in trouble and started becoming something uglier, a nation watching one of its former golden boys come apart in real time. In April 2019, Reuters reported that Park was arrested on allegations that he had bought about 1.5 grams of methamphetamine with his former girlfriend and used it several times. What made the shock hit harder was that he had already gone public to deny any drug use. Reuters also reported that his agency said it would terminate his contract and that he would leave the entertainment industry. That sequence changed everything, because denial leaves a stain even before guilt is settled in the public mind. Once a star says, "I didn't do it," and then the story turns against him, the scandal becomes more than criminal. It becomes personal. It turns into betrayal. The audience stops asking only what happened. It starts asking whether any version of the man they believed in was real at all. And with Park Yoo-chun, that question was brutal. He had once belonged to the class of celebrities people thought could survive almost anything. TVXQ made him huge. JYJ made him resilient. Acting made him respectable. But scandal has a way of attacking exactly what fame spends years building. It doesn't just hit the career, it hits the narrative. And Park's narrative was one of scale, glamour, and permanence. Now it looked fragile. Reports after the case made that collapse even harder to ignore. By mid-2019, he received a 10-month prison sentence suspended for 2 years in the drug case, according to contemporaneous coverage. Later reporting also noted that his domestic career had effectively stalled and that much of his later activity shifted abroad, especially outside Korea. That is the part people remember longest. Not only that he fell, but how complete the fall looked. Because once a star at Park Yoo-chun's level is no longer protected by image, everything reverses. The same fame that once made him feel untouchable now magnified every headline. The same public that once helped build his legend became the crowd watching the wreckage. And the man who once seemed too famous to disappear was suddenly being discussed less as an artist and more as a warning. That is when a scandal stops being an incident. It becomes the new identity. And Park Yoo-chun was now trapped inside it. What came after the scandal may be the bleakest part of Park Yoo-chun's story. Not the arrest itself, not the headlines, not even the courtroom. What came after was worse. Because once a star loses the protection of his own image, he does not just fall. He keeps falling in public memory, over and over again, every time his name comes back and people remember what he used to be. That is what happened to Park Yoo-chun. The case did not merely interrupt his career, it rewrote the meaning of it. Reuters reported that in 2019 he was arrested on drug charges involving alleged methamphetamine purchases and use after publicly denying wrongdoing. His agency then said it would terminate his contract and that he would leave the entertainment industry. Later that year, he received a 10-month prison sentence suspended for 2 years. Subsequent coverage noted that much of his later activity shifted outside Korea, as his domestic standing had been badly damaged. And that is the part people rarely understand about celebrity ruin. The punishment is not only legal, it is narrative. A public figure like Park Yoo-chun does not live on talent alone. He lives on accumulated belief, the belief that he is worthy of devotion, worthy of nostalgia, worthy of emotional investment. Once that belief cracks, everything built on top of it starts looking unstable. The music changes, the performances change, old footage changes. Even memories begin to feel contaminated. That is why his collapse hits so differently. He was not a marginal celebrity. He was not some one-era name people had already half forgotten. He had been one of the defining male stars of a generation, first through TVXQ, then JYJ, then acting. He belonged to the level of fame where people assume permanence, and permanence makes downfall feel almost obscene. The higher the pedestal, the more fascinated the public becomes when it watches the marble split. What remained after that was something harsher than scandal. It was residue. A man once associated with screaming crowds, Asia-wide popularity, and screen success was now associated with a case file, a suspended sentence, and the humiliation of seeing his own denial collapse under the weight of the story that followed. Even when he continued to exist, even when he continued to make appearances elsewhere, the center of gravity had shifted. He was no longer the star who survived. He had become the star people bring up when they talk about ruin. That kind of identity is hard to escape, because scandal does not simply stain a celebrity. Sometimes it becomes the frame through which the public chooses to remember everything that came before it. Every triumph begins looking like setup. Every success starts reading like irony. The old image remains visible, but it is no longer innocent. It is haunted by what came later. And maybe that is the real tragedy of Park Yoo-chun. Not just that he fell, not just that he lost the clean myth of who he once was, but that he fell from a height so extreme that the world could not look away from the damage. Some stars disappear quietly. He didn't. His downfall was too public, too dramatic, too loaded with contradiction. The idol prince, the respected actor, the man who denied it, the man who was arrested. The career that looked too large to collapse then did exactly that. That is why his story still lingers. Because Park Yoo-chun is no longer just a celebrity biography. He is a warning about what happens when fame becomes so massive that people confuse it with moral protection. About what happens when a public image gets mistaken for character. About how quickly a man can move from being adored across Asia to becoming a cautionary tale, people say, with a different tone in their voice. He once looked too established to break. Now that break is the story. And maybe that is the cruelest ending of all, not simply losing everything, but living long enough to watch the world remember you more for the collapse than for the empire you built before it.